Welcome to our briefing today. Tomorrow, the Senate Rules Committee is holding a markup on the Secure Elections Act, which is bipartisan legislation focusing on cybersecurity for America's voting systems. This bill is commonly referred to these as the SEA, and you'll often hear that acronym during today. That's not the only bill that's been proposed in this Congress. There are several others, although it is the only one that's getting some movement right now. There's a House version of the SEA that is pretty similar, sponsored by Representatives Rooney and Hine. There's the PAPER Act, which PAPER stands for something fancy, sponsored by Representatives Meadow and Langevin. The Election Security Act, sponsored by Representative Thompson, and Protecting America Votes in Elections, or the PAVE Act, sponsored by Senator Wyden. These bills and this activity comes amid continued reports from the United States intelligence community and media organizations that American elections remain a target of foreign adversaries. And while states have taken steps since 2016, these steps are uneven, and standards in this space are also uneven. How should the federal government respond to these growing threats? And what's the appropriate role for federal authorities relative to states in dealing with the national security challenge of election meddling? My name is Trey Grayson. I was the Kentucky Secretary of State for a couple of terms in the last decade, during which time I led both the National Association of Secretaries of State as well as the Republican Association of Secretaries of States. And I'm now back in Kentucky as an attorney with the law firm of Frost Brown Todd and focusing pretty much with the government relations subsidiary Civic Point. But I'm still very active in elections as both an attorney and a consultant, but as well as a volunteer. And today I'm joined by a distinguished group of panelists, and I'm going to just do a quick introduction, and we're going to let each of them talk once I'm done with all the introductions. So today I'm joined by two conservative leaders and three subject matter experts. Together we're going to examine the prospects of current election security reform proposals, including the SEA. We're also going to highlight best practices for cyber defense and verification of election results. So let me introduce you to the folks up here, starting on the left, which is kind of a funny spot for this gentleman. Grover Norquist is the president of Americans for Tax Reform, an organization he founded in 1985, one of the most influential leaders of the conservative movement for the past few decades. Grover's hosted a long-running Wednesday meeting, a weekly gathering of conservative activists that's taken place at ATR since the mid-90s. Adam Brandon is the president of FreedomWorks, a grassroots service center to millions of activists who support smaller government, lower taxes, free markets, personal liberty, and the rule of law. Adam joined FreedomWorks in 2005, starting in the press department and gradually moving into a management role. So if we have any interns or entry-level staffers, follow his model. It can work for you too. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer is a retired intelligence operative and currently serves as a Fox News commentator and vice president of the London Center for Policy Research. Tony's also a member of the advisory board to Trump 2020, the president's re-election campaign. Brenda Cabrera has served as the general registrar and director of elections for the city of Fairfax, Virginia for the past 3 years. A few weeks ago, under her leadership, the Fairfax City tested a risk-limiting audit, or an RLA. That's another acronym you will hear today. The first to be administered in Virginia and one of the first nationally. And finally, Mark Schneider is currently a principal cybersecurity engineer for the MITRE Corporation. Mark is the principal investigator on a research project involving cybersecurity challenges from IoT, Internet of Things systems, but he's also supporting projects, research projects on smart homes, smart cities, and secure voting systems. Please join me in welcoming our panel. So I introduced them in reverse order from how they're going to talk, just to be fancy. So we're going to start with Mark, and we'll just kind of work our way down. They've got a couple minutes of kind of some observations, and then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And we've got microphones, so for those who have questions, I'll ask you to come up to the microphone so those who are watching either live on the stream or when it's archived can hear the questions. Thanks. Mark.
Hopefully everybody can hear me on the mic. As was said, I'm a cybersecurity engineer by training and practice. And election security is a little different from most other types of security and cybersecurity in that there's a number of interesting wrinkles. And one of those wrinkles is that in addition to actually making sure a system is, has properties of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which are the standard triad of cybersecurity. You have to be able to prove to people that the integrity of the system is intact. It's not sufficient just that the system's integrity is intact. And that adds a very interesting wrinkle that doesn't exist in other areas of security. One of the interesting ways to approach this is this idea of software independence that was introduced by a professor at MIT by the name of Ron Rivest and a researcher at NIST, John Wack. And the idea here is that if you build an election system which is independent of software for determining whether or not the outcome is correct, and if there's an error or other problem with the software, we'll be able to either correct for that error or notify the system that the outcome is not correct. Then if there are attempts at an adversary to breach a system, to change results, whatever, the system will be able to detect that and hopefully correct for that. Practically, the lowest cost, real-world way to implement this is with voter-verified durable records and risk-limiting audits, or RLAs. Most common type of these durable records are paper ballots. Sort of the gold standard is to have voter-verified paper ballots that are then audited by hand using no computers or software. And one of the things that actually, if you look at some of the risk-limiting audits that have been done out in, I know in Colorado, I don't know if, Brenda, you had done this, but actually dice were used to randomly select stuff. They didn't even want to trust the computers to generate random numbers to pull ballots for audit. There's a lot of risk that's introduced when you start adding more complex systems. The idea with the audit is it's an overall check of the outcome, and you want that check to be easy to prove that it is correct, and you want to reduce the chances for errors. So you want the system to be simple, use simple technology like dice, and minimize the what's called the attack surface, or the places that an adversary could attack the system.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Brenda.
Thank you for having me today. I'm Brenda Cabrera with the City of Fairfax. I've been working in elections since 1988, so I have a long years of experience. I was with a large locality for about 20 years, and then I've been with the City of Fairfax as the director for the last 3 years. And if the math doesn't work out, I apologize.
Good enough for government.
Exactly. So I received a phone call at some point several months ago asking if the City of Fairfax would take on a pilot for a risk-limiting audit in Virginia, and in response to essentially the bill that was coming into effect July 1st, which requires the state of Virginia to have risk-limiting audits. And we did not have policies and procedures in place yet for that. So the idea that we would conduct a pilot, and then we would learn some things and be able to understand from there what we needed to write going forward. And I think immediately said no. So I didn't know anything about risk-limiting audits, and I don't like to do things poorly, so I was concerned about my ability really to do something I didn't know anything about. And what ensued was really an education in risk-limiting audits that I'm now very grateful for. And I've gone from the opinion of, oh my goodness, this is something we're going to have to do in Virginia, might as well figure out how to do it, to this is the right thing to do, and we should be doing it. And Virginia's law requires you to have a risk-limiting audit in your locality every 5 years. I'm really hoping that we can do that much more often in the city of Fairfax. So to me, a risk-limiting audit, we as election professionals, we audit many, many things. We don't call ourselves auditors, but we audit lots of things. We audit ballot custody. We audit voter registration records. We audit lots of things. And then we have this election, and then we have canvass the next day, and then we're done with that election. We put it away, and we go forward. And it seems to me in any sort of design process or, in any sort of design process or continuous quality improvement process, you have to close that loop and say, how did we do? And so a risk limiting audit allows us to go back to the election and look at how did we do in the last election, what anomalies are there, were there discrepancies. It's information that we need to have in order to move forward with our next election.
Tony, before you go, I want to ask Brenda, would you kind of define, when you talk about a risk limiting audit, just so everybody in the audience understands, you're not talking about like a full-blown recount of an election or a challenge. Like what does a risk limiting audit look like? How many ballots? And I realize that, do you count all the ballots, some of the ballots?
So the beauty of a risk limiting audit is that it is not a full recount. That is the reason for not doing a full recount, because then in some localities, larger localities, you would be looking at days and days, and you would still introduce a certain amount of error into that process. So a risk limiting audit has math magic involved in it, and it determines based on the margin of the win and the type of risk limiting audit you're doing. It determines a sample size that you sample. We did 3 different audits. We did a batch comparison as if the city of Fairfax was called on by the state to do a part of the state. We picked one precinct and we hand counted that precinct. So that was our batch comparison. We did a ballot comparison. We are a precinct-based in Virginia, and we don't centrally scan. So every precinct scans their ballots during the day, and then they pull the tabulations at the end of the evening, which is very different from what you're used to hearing about in like Colorado, who's very good at that. So we did we had to rescan our ballots for the ballot comparison, and then we compared those totals and the totals for the candidates to the totals we had on Election Day, and we did that on an independent scanner, so it was not using the same software that we used on Election Day. We did a ballot polling audit with the sample for the ballot comparison was about 70 ballots, and the sample for the ballot polling was about 260, 300 ballots, which is one disadvantage of a ballot polling is it takes a larger sample in order to accomplish it. And ballot polling is just like standing at the door of the polling place and saying, how did you vote? How did you vote? Getting a statistical sample.
Except we're not actually asking how people voted, right?
No. We're looking at the ballots, and so we're sampling the ballots to say, this is a large enough sample to say that this audit verifies what happened on Election Day.
Great. Thanks. Tony, you've had lots of experience doing lots of interesting things around the world.
Yes. As Michael likes me to say, I'm the person your mother told you to stay away from when you were a kid. So. And it's true. As a matter of fact, my Bond moment from being an operative is actually in the International Spy Museum, so you can go by and actually see that. So, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to be kind of, how to put it in a polite term, underhanded, devious, trying to figure out how to break into things. And I probably would have been on the criminal side if I hadn't been an operative on our side. But the idea here is that we have people who look at all hazards and try to do things. I'll start off by saying that one of the things I find most disconcerting in the media is I think, a deceptive picture of what's going on. This is today. Microsoft says it has found a Russian operation targeting U.S. political institutions. Russians are targeting everything all the time. This is constant. This is deceptive. We need to be clear-eyed and steely-eyed about who is all out there trying to upset the cart of apples. The Russians are not the only ones. The Russians have been trying to eat our lunch since the beginning of the Cold War. 10 years ago, one of the think tanks I belonged to, Center for Advanced Defense Studies, was being targeted by the Russians, both by Anna Chapman. I was a target of hers, plus cyber because we were working with a major defense contractor. This is nothing new. What we need to understand is a constant and persistent threat that we have to address as we're going through today. And it's not just nation states, it's 17-year-olds. There is a thing in Political today about 17-year-olds breaking in. And this reminds me back in the days, in the early days of our counter-cyber operation in the late 1990s. The Chinese were co-opting kids, Canadian kids, to be their pointy end of the spear to go into our systems. We actually detected early on Chinese online recruitment of Canadian youth to make it look like it was just Canadian kids breaking into our systems while it was really China. This is what we're up against, and it's not gotten any better. It's only going to get worse. So this is why so many of these measures we're talking about today are imperative. And it's not just about hacking, it's about what we call close access. This is where actual hardware is compromised. You can put an embed on hardware which resides, turns itself on and off, and it's nearly indetectable. So that's why the audits were taught, the risk-limiting audits, durable records, and physical eyes on the audit. Not to use a machine to do an audit. You got to have physical human beings involved, human in the loop. You cannot delegate this to a machine, which also may be compromised. This is too important. So we need to now understand that there are large entities and small entities interested in what we're doing as a nation. And a lot of them may not even have an objective of what they're doing, simply to do it, simply to interfere with our democracy, with what we do as a people. They don't have to have a clear motive. Some instances, they may want to upset things. But in most instances, they simply want to interfere. They simply want to gain access and do things which will upset our ability to have confidence in our election process. We've already seen the chaos that can be caused by disruption and causing essentially misgivings about our own process. So this is something, I actually wore my blue and red tie today to illustrate the fact this is a blue and red issue, both sides. I've talked to Tulsi Gabbard, I've talked to the Liberty Coalition. Everybody understands and agrees this is too important for we as a people to not acknowledge, try to find a method, and I'm a big 10th Amendment guy. I don't believe in dictating to the states or local municipalities what needs to be done. Best practices based on practitioner experience needs to be the way we go forward. So, as we move forward, I do recommend whatever you all can do to help carry the message of certain common sense things that need to go into the law regarding the durable records, the human in the loop, and the risk-limiting audits are all imperative to the legislation for it to be effective. So, thank you.
Okay. Adam.
I guess I wore my black tie in fear.
For the helicopters?
That's right. So I want to go forward we're all going to get in a time vessel here for a second. We're going to go to the midterms, right? And we hit the midterms, and this is going to be the most evenly divided. It's going to be very close, right? So you get through this midterms. You then head to the next presidential election in 2020. And let's just pretend for a second that your candidate wins or your candidate loses. And the country, again, the Congress is just razor thin. And then a couple of years later, you have some legislation, and we get to 2022. So now we're 4 years into the future. And we find out that some bad actor, whether it's 17-year-old Canadians of dubious note or the Chinese or the Iranians, they got into a couple of states, and they messed with the vote, and that our election was wrong. Can you imagine going to work that morning? You think this country's divided now? Imagine if we've had the wrong president for 2 years, and we've had the wrong Congress for 2 years. What happens to all that legislation that was passed in those 2 years? Is it nullified? Do you impeach the president? Does the president resign? Can you imagine the crisis in legitimacy our nation would face? And as you've heard from all these other experts so far, this is a legitimate threat. And we worry about nuclear weapons, we worry about, you fill in the issue. This is a legitimate threat, and it is a threat that we have the ability to actually audit, to watch, and ensure that that crisis Think about that crisis in 4 years. This might be the greatest crisis since the American Civil War. We have the opportunity to make sure that that doesn't happen. I believe that election security is a federal issue. And you said, you're a 10th Amendment person, I'm a 10th Amendment person. But in the Constitution, you have general welfare and common defense. Well, to me, this is common defense. I come from Cleveland, Ohio, Cuyahoga County. I can guarantee you that Cuyahoga County is not prepared to go against the best of the Chinese when it comes to cybersecurity. This is a real threat. So the Secure Election Act, I mean, this is, especially the first version, is something at FreedomWorks that we've supported. I am concerned that it's getting watered down. What I'm definitely looking for is voter-verified paper ballots to be included in any final bits of legislation. And I know there's this concern that this is federalizing elections. I do not see this even coming close to federalizing elections. Federalizing elections means there's this common standard for that every election across the country has to follow. What we're just asking for here, what I'm supporting, is that you have this paper ballot that's voter verified, that we can conduct these audits, and the states are going to, Colorado can still do its vote by mail, and some other state can still do something different, but we need just to make sure you have this paper ballot that you can have this audit. And again, we know, it's been covered by other folks here, we know this threat is real. That 4-year crisis from now, this is a legitimate crisis. So I'm a big fan of meaningful audits. And even when you start hearing, well, these machines, they're tamper-proof, as Tony was saying here, there's different parts of the process that can be compromised. There could either be someone who's just lazy and has programming error. And what if a programming error, it wasn't even malicious, it wasn't the Iranians or the Chinese, what if it's just programming error that ended up changing the course of American history? This is just a common sense way to ensure that that doesn't happen. And our republic has stood through multiple crises because at the end of the day, Americans look at our system as being legitimate. This is a direct threat to the legitimacy of our entire system. And how do we, I'm sure we have our problems right now that we'll come together eventually on, but if you undermine the absolute integrity of our ballot system and you undermine the legitimacy of our system, I think you'll have a crisis that, that gets to the existential threat of this entire country.
Thanks, Grover.
Yeah, I was talking with Mark Guerin, who worked with the Clinton guys, and he said, Grover, when are we going to, this is a long time ago, when are we going to get past all this really rough partisan stuff? And I said, when you guys give up. When one team with the others like way ahead, then you don't have some of the nastiness and so on. But we do have that, and for some time. And we don't have to imagine in the future what would happen if people had called into question an election. The 2000 election was called into question. If it hadn't been for September 11th, we'd still be debating that. They had paper ballots, and they counted them a dozen times, and people still want to contest that. So I just think that this is a very, very important project to make sure that we get both as honest elections as we can in this zone, and that this zone can't be corrupted, to have the verifiable paper ballots along with whatever is done by computer, by mechanism. I mean, we've all seen Casablanca, and we know that you can fix machines, so we shouldn't tell people to trust the machine, that people can't make it come out red or black if they put their finger in the right place. But we also have to, when Claudia snuck into the Good Goddess Festival and was supposedly trying to smooch on Caesar's second wife, this was found not to have happened, but Caesar still divorced her, right? Because Caesar's wife has to be above suspicion. And our elections have to be above suspicion. Not just for us. What if we all agreed that it was beyond suspicion, but Europe didn't, or the rest of the world didn't, or Latin America thought we had phony elections? It is hugely important in the United States, if we're going to make a case by example, to have democratic elections, and that however much China or Russia seem to be able to do things with a dictatorship, we certainly have to at least have real democratic elections, and the world needs to see that and believe it. So I do think the arguments, this is foreign policy, this is national security, this can be interfered with. There are lots of questions that this doesn't answer. This doesn't, and I think both parties have, I believe in bipartisanship, when both parties do something for their own reasons. I never trust it when they say they're getting together to do it for the good of the country. That's what they do for pay increases and fighting term limits and pension hikes. That's not bipartisanship. But the Democrats want to be able to say, we're for fair elections, as if some weren't recently. How about that? And the Republicans need to be prepared for making sure that that is never an argument that can work. So each, looking back, says, okay, guys, R's and D's should both want the most robust, honest elections we can have in this zone. The Democrats can still steal elections from absentee ballots and mail-in ballots, so it doesn't get in the way of what they want to do. And the Republicans have to deal with that on their own. But this part of election security can be greatly improved. R's and D's can both agree on that. It doesn't get in the way of federalism or a sense of the states don't have the rights to steal electoral votes because those are national things, those electoral votes. And I think it's very, very important that we move forward on this and make it as tight and as secure as possible. Because if you do it halfway, that's almost worse, because then somebody comes in and gets past the fact that you didn't do it all the way as well as you should have. And then people go, well, who was the guy who made the amendment that watered it down? This is helpful. This is a huge step in the right direction. There are other parts of fair elections and ballot fraud that you can look at in other zones. It's not that one doesn't combat that, but let's take this off the table and make sure that we don't have 2000s or the ability to try and go. This last election, a little bit different because it wasn't close, but it's still, I mean, a great deal of noise and so on did the Russians swing the election. So let's get this off the table and so that it doesn't happen in the future.
So if I could add just a couple of observations. When I was Secretary of State, I still remember the call that I was on in 2006. A couple of states had examined the DREs, the electronic voting systems that were, in 06, we were rolling out all across the country to provide, to solve the accessibility problem and also to address some of the problems we saw with punch card voting in Florida. And I remember I was in my office in the state capitol, and my state elections director was in her office in another building, and we were talking to some computer scientists, and they were explaining the vulnerabilities. This is 12 years ago with these voting systems. And they were gaping, and it was scary. And we hung up on the conference call, and I immediately picked up the phone, and I called Sarah, and I was like, oh my God, although there might have been an F word in between the M and the G of that phrase. And we immediately said, all right, we need paper in Kentucky. But I didn't have the ability to mandate it, but I thought, here's the data, we want to do it, we're going to kind of use the bully pulpit. And I was shocked that even 10 years later, 12 years later, there's still counties in Kentucky that actually not still just have legacy systems, they're buying more because they don't have that mandate, because we don't have something like the Secure Elections Act which will establish a best practice floor for cybersecurity. I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican, just like some of the other folks in this panel. I normally hate federal election laws. I actually led the charge against some federal election laws when I was at NAS, the Secretary of State's Association. But this is different, as you've heard. This is serious. It's national security, and there's clear best practices that we can adopt. We've heard about paper ballots, voter verification, audits, risk-limiting audits. Brenda, how many? What was your confidence level? How many ballots did you actually count into some of those different? We were talking about dozens or hundreds, not thousands, right, of actual votes. And I realize you did several different types.
Right. One of the learning. I think one of the reasons that we were asked to volunteer was because we had a relatively small election. We audited the Republican primary that was held in Virginia in June. And so we had just under 1,000 ballots. And for a pilot, that was really nice to be able to manage. And the batch audit, we audited 61 ballots from a precinct. For the comparison, where we looked at the cast vote record and the physical ballot to compare them to make sure they matched, we did about 71 and then about 300 for the polling polling audit.
Sure, so
And
even
our
in your
risk-
largest one, you were only 30%.
We were only 30%, right. We probably would have, if we had actually been doing a real audit and not doing 3 at a time, we probably would have actually had to increase that sample size because it didn't meet our risk limit of 5%.
But I think in the process, though, you probably learned that the cost benefit of this, there's a lot of benefit, as we've talked about, and the cost as far as time, staff, money, not a whole lot relative to the confidence that your citizens are going to receive from this effort.
Right. I mean, it doesn't really matter what I do if the winner doesn't believe they're the winner and the loser doesn't believe that they're the loser. So the audit would be, I've been through full recounts before, and I would much rather do an audit than a full recount. And I'm also, the city of Fairfax is inside the county of Fairfax, which is vast in size compared to us. And so it's real easy for me to see how would you scale this to a larger locality, and a full recount in a larger locality would be, it would be enormous.
But I mean, Colorado's done it, at least not statewide, but they did it in their large county jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
well, I mean, in Virginia, if you have to do a recount, you have to do a
Oh, recount, yeah, recount is enormous.
Right. So a recount after every election to audit your election would be
Right.
would be a lot.
Yeah.
So this allows you to scale that down even in a large locality.
So maybe this is more for you, Mark. One of the things that we sometimes hear is that if we can get enough confidence in our election by doing just auditing some digital images. We don't actually have to pull out the actual paper, that we could generate either from an electronic system, or all modern scanners, when they scan the ballot, take a picture anyway, which is helpful in case there's a problem with the ballot. But they store that inside. We sometimes hear people say, no, we can just audit that. What are your thoughts on a digital image audit?
Sure. So the biggest problem with a digital image audit is your electronic record, your CVR, your cast vote record, and the digital image come from a single source. Okay, you can't, if you compromise that source, you've compromised both. So you don't really have this independent mechanism that is voter verified. Okay, you may have the image, you may have an interpretation stored as a record of that image, but the voter never was able to actually look at that
Yeah, you wouldn't know for sure.
digital content. If I could just make one comment about what was said earlier, one of the interesting properties of risk limiting audits is they're an iterative process. So you can design them so they minimize the number of ballots you have to pull, and so they can be very cost effective that way.
I read recently that in the Alabama U.S. Senate special election, which had pretty high turnout for a special election, it was a statewide race, obviously, to get a 95% confidence, it was about 500 to 600 ballots that you'd have to pull.
Yep.
It's not a lot of work to have that kind of confidence in an election. Tony?
To carry on the point regarding auditing large databases of data, one of the analogies I've discussed that we've seen problems with this in the past was an exercise called Moonlight Maze. This is back in the late 90s. And Trey, you might remember I mentioned this last time about the blood supply. Basically, during these exercises, this is a global exercise that DoD runs to try to figure out both operationally and logistically how they're going to sustain combat operations. One of our hacking teams was able to get into and compromise the database which contained information relating to the global blood supply. And it was a very simple hack with huge consequences, because the moment you were able to penetrate the database and compromise the information, you no longer had an understanding of what resources you had available, thereby making that entire supply unavailable. It's all there, didn't go anywhere, but you don't know where it's at, you don't know how to get to it, and by the time you figure it out, it's going to be too late. So we have a similar thing here too. So that's why the idea here of having paper, having a realistic audit trail of real material that you can physically get out and look at is so important. I would not suggest leaving something to a large database ever, because of the potential of compromising the data within that database at some point.
I know both Adam and Grover, you kind of framed this, but I just want to, just to make it precisely clear, why do you all, again, I would include myself in the category, but I'm going to ask each of you, like, why should a conservative support something like the Secure Elections Act as it was introduced? You know, why are you guys here today? There's a lot of other things you could be doing on this not so great weather day, but nonetheless, how can we get more of, because one of the things that's been, I've been working with, and it's been a little bit frustrating, is on the SEA, on the Secure Elections Act, for every Republican that gets added as a co-sponsor, there's an immediate Democrat that wants to join on. And it would be great if we could have, I mean, I realize you don't get bills with tons of co-sponsors in the Senate. We've got 6 of each party. But there are a lot more Republicans who ought to be signing on to this bill, who ought to be pressuring it so that the bill is written in the right way. Why are you guys up here? Why are you taking the time to join coalitions, to participate in conversations like this? And what can we tell our fellow conservatives why they need to jump on board, even though reflexively they're probably opposed to something like this?
I'm not sure it's an absolute, it costs some money, and it's the federal government doing something. So those are both bad ideas in general. But every once in a while, there's something that the federal government needs to do, and I'll think of one in a moment other than this bill. But given that, the Ds are also have been out there going, we're passing this because Trump election. And if you can get past that and go, if this bill had been passed, you wouldn't be having the Trump discussion, so don't you wish you'd had it? And besides, there's going to be this discussion in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. I believe we're going to be winning elections over the next 20 years, and I would like to have them certified and not debatable. So I think unless you're planning on losing elections, you should be for this bill. And I think it is a less intrusive federal versus state problematic bill than many others, and I think it is a very good start at moving towards cleaner, fairer, certifiably honest elections.
Great. Adam, you want to add anything? That was pretty good.
Well, I'm kind of more doing this out of a personal thing. I'm an American first, and my political affiliation's down the road a little bit. So this is an absolute legitimate threat that our country faces. When you see a legitimate threat, especially one, I mean, this is one that has a pretty simple solution right now. This is much less complex than most of the other issues that we're dealing with in this country. So it's pretty easy for me, and also as someone who's going to be doing this in this industry for a long time, I don't want to, like a few years from now, have to start every conversation I get into trying to explain that, yes, we still have a legitimate and good system. I'd rather start from the policy or the politics. And so this is a way to ensure that we're never having to talk about the absolute bedrock foundations of our republic.
Well, I think the panel's giving the audience a lot to chew on. We'd love to invite you all to the conversation. We've got 2 microphones in the middle, and happy to have you come up. My request is, when I ran the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, we always had 3 rules for the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. One was you identify yourself, you identify your affiliation, and then your speech. There is no speech. There's a question, and a question ends in a question mark, and you keep it brief. And so we're going to have JFK Jr. Forum rules in effect. There got to be some questions from folks in the audience. Whether it's clarification, don't feel bad if you need something clarified. There's some technical stuff we've talked about. We're happy to clarify, or dive into some of the deeper policy or politics questions.
When I was in college, a speech in place of a question was known as a Harvard question.
Yeah. You would give the speech and you'd say, don't you agree? Question mark. See, I complied with the rule. Like, no. That's questions from the audience. Come on, who's got the first? I was going to say first grade. Why don't you come on up into the microphone, and you're going to go first. You're going to be our role model, right? You're going to do this right? Don't. Oh, name, okay. So no, name, affiliate. Yeah. Perfect. So you got 2 out of 3 so far, and now you're going to do the question.
Just to be certain, when you say voter verified, you are speaking specifically about the paper ballot? That's the question. What does that mean? And the second part of the question is, if we have risk limiting audits, is this something that can be tailored to each state with its own unique voting system?
Perfect. 2 great questions. Mark, I saw you lean forward to push the button, so it sounds like you want to answer at least part of that.
Sure. So in terms of what voter verified mean, that means that the voter is able to verify that the ballot that they cast accurately reflects their choices. So it's from the voter to the point that they're casting it. If you're using paper and a metal box with a slit in it, it's the voter can verify it up until the moment they slip it into that box. From the box to the tabulation and reporting is election verification. It's also important, but it's something different from voter verification.
And if the votes are being cast on an electronic voting machine, kind of like an ATM, when you hear the term DRE, that's kind of what that means. There is a way to do voter verification with that, with a printer next to it, right?
Right. So that's referred to as a VVPAT typically, or voter verified paper audit trail. And there, everything's done digitally, like the ATM or touchscreen, and that creates the record directly. But then an audit record is printed out that is on paper that can be later used to match up the electronic records with the audit information written out on that printer.
Yeah. And yet then the piece of paper stays with the machine, which then allows it to be used during the audit.
Right. Normally, you'll have like a clear piece of plexiglass or something, and once you confirm that it's correct, it'll move forward into the bin, and the next blank piece will be ready to go.
Remember when they first started talking about this in our state, they were like, "You mean we get a receipt, we could take it to the vote buyer?" I'm like, "No, behind the glass, please." Great first question. Thanks for being a good role model. Other questions from the audience? Oh, yeah, there was a second one. Oh, customized to states, yeah. Actually, Brenda, you've worked in 2 different states.
So both my experiences actually in Virginia, 2 different sizes.
Oh, okay.
But I think with Colorado's model of vote by mail only, and then Virginia's working on precinct-based, with the different types of audits that are available to do, I think this is definitely something that every state should be able to figure out their version of a risk-limiting audit. Absolutely.
I know Cuyahoga County has done this for their elections, and a few others. There were some EAC grants a few years ago that allowed jurisdictions to experiment. It's still relatively new. I mean, that's why you're doing pilots, but it does appear to be something that can work in different size jurisdictions, different states, different counting methods. Yeah.
The other thing I'd like to add about that is I think this is something, it is an iterative process, and we did 3 different pilots, and from that we'll get information and we'll create some procedures and processes, and then 2 years down the road we'll keep looking at those and keep improving them. I think you have to be willing to do that, with the end goal being that important that we're gonna keep doing this and until we get it where we want it.
Great. Other questions? That was a great first question. Yeah.
Adam,
you have a question?
Question
No.
for Tony, actually. When you see these threats, what is their goal? Is their goal just to have chaos in our system, or is the goal to actually eventually swing elections?
Well, I think it depends on who the actor is. And it's a great question, and let me try to answer it very quickly, because I think this could be an hour question answer. You have some organizations and entities which simply want to create chaos and a perception that our system is not secure. That's it, just to upset the cart of apples. There are other more sophisticated nation states, and I would put it into the category of the Chinese, Russia, and even Iran, who have a massive intelligence system which is linked, that their hacking capability is linked into this larger gathering capability. And for those of you who are not familiar, there's some great historic books you ought to go back and read. Dr. Peter Pry did a book called War Scared 1983. Talks about how the Russians had put together an intelligence collection system called RIAN, that was promulgated on the belief that we're going to launch first on them. And it's just a great exposure of how the Russians think and how they do things. And I would encourage you to educate yourself, both by the fact it's a great historic lesson to look at how perceptions were managed both ways. And let's remember, much about what we're talking about technology, but in essence, it's all about perception. It's about perception management. Perception is reality. So never forget, and no offense to the technology folks, that technology by itself is nothing compared to what it can do to shape and change perception. So this is what the ultimate bottom line is that in some cases the perception management of our system could be done in such a way to create chaos where candidates don't trust the results. And if they don't trust the results, will you? Will us? Will we as the people understand? So this is why it's so important to understand the threat. So I can't tell you who's the most vociferous or most likely threat. This is something that I know Mike Pompeo. I met with Mike a couple times when he was director of CIA. I know Mike and the intelligence community is working on this. I think at any given time we know more about the threat than we're willing to let on, which is a good thing. With that said, and one of the grand ironies here is you may have overlapping threats doing different things at the same time. These people don't coordinate necessarily. I mean, think about it. I mean, you could have all these people, it's called a form of fratricide, all the bad guys. There's a great scene in the beginning of The Naked Gun, first movie. Leslie Nielsen comes in and all the bad guys, Muammar Gaddafi, are sitting at the table coordinating badness against us.
If only it were like that.
If only it were like that. You know, it kind of channelizes them. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, drop a Moab on that.
Yeah,
we're done.
be done. But it doesn't work like that. So we're not only trying to define threat as the intelligence community, we're trying to navigate the chaos. And oh, by the way, not that I'm saying we do it, but we may have our own offensive capabilities in this area too. These are all things which are constantly being considered as a larger part of our intelligence and national security effort. But on the defensive side, on the idea of best practices, this is the most basic thing we must do to make sure that our house is in order to stop people like me who are on the other side trying to be able to navigate and do harm. Does that answer your question?
Should I check to make sure my wallet is still in my pocket? Or
I wouldn't worry about the wallet. I'd worry about what's your numbers.
I've been watching your phone just to make sure.
I'm moving it over this way. I trust Grover with it.
We can work to fight against other countries messing with our electoral system without getting all high and mighty about it. I mean, Allende won in Chile because instead of picking one of the two conservative parties, we split the money we used to give to one of the two conservative parties, and they split the vote, and Allende gets to win. So we've been participating in other people's elections for quite some time, up until the present. So without going, oh, we don't have to pretend we never do this. We've been doing this for a long time, usually with cash. And it's other people's job, I guess, to try and stop us. But we should make sure they're not doing it to us. We can have another discussion about whether we ought to be running other people's elections.
Yeah, and let me add to that real quick. The policy of the last administration, and I know this from actually having been called in to assist on a number of operations to include the Federal Reserve, and the policy was to not respond to threats. Why that is, I don't know. It was well documented. This last election, the Russians were targeting, and the White House told their cyber folks, stand down. That, to me, is something Congress needs to investigate. But the policy should be one based on understanding the real threats and countering each threat based on its motivation. Some threats you may not want to necessarily counter but monitor. Some threats you want to actually counter and go back offensively. Other threats you may want to be able to mess with. That's the best way I can put it without getting anything classified. But the idea here is that we need to have a clear understanding that this is another key military domain, intelligence domain that we have to address.
Got a question from the audience.
Yes. Amy Sanchez, I'm a former voting rights attorney and longtime Senate staffer. I guess I have two questions. How do you utilize the VRA and HAVA, especially with appropriations, which provide a clear role for the federal government and conducting how states conduct, in the logistics, their elections? And how do you suggest from the human audit, paper ballot, implementation perspective, address concerns from the voting rights community to ensure that traditionally disenfranchised voters aren't further disenfranchised, especially with provisional ballots and how to conduct voter education?
So before we answer, for the audience, the VRA is Voting Rights Act, and HAVA is the Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002 after the Florida 2000 election. Brenda, you've probably had some experience. You've obviously had a lot of experience dealing in a VRA, Java world, accessibility and other concerns. I mean, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Honestly, I'm not sure I really understand the question.
Like, I think the question is, you're basically saying, how do we balance the security concerns with accessibility, whether from all types of accessibility to our elections, so that they're open to all? Is that basically in the distilling it? Does that help?
Where's the conflict? I understand some places you have some argument about voter ID and so on. This is not that. This is once you voted, do we have a paper trail as well as? Where do you see it?
So anytime you have a paper process, there's always concerns about, especially from a human audit, when you want real eyes put on that, this can be another means by which to further disenfranchise the traditionally disenfranchised. We see it in other aspects in, adapting to the technology, in, pushing voters off rolls to, further, secure elections, supposedly, how do you address their concerns as to how this would impact traditionally disenfranchised voters? And then for Java, is there a way to use the appropriations process to, I know we're not supposed to legislate on appropriations, but we do it all the time. Do you consider that a vehicle to strengthen and get to the place you want?
So I'll the second one. There was some report language in the money that was in the last bill, which was arguably Java money, or at least it was tied to Java. Report language is not binding, but that's probably close. Now, I probably would have preferred more specific report language, but it's still report language. Although, Congress can sort of do whatever it wants. They have all these rules about the way we normally do things, and you have the whatever majority means in each chamber, vote for it. You can do it that way.
Maybe I can try to address. I agree with Grover. I don't see an issue here. Let me try to address this as a analogy. A point of sale at Home Depot. If you're roving around Home Depot and trying to buy something, nobody cares what you're going to buy. Once you go to the point of sale and you pay your money, what we're talking about here is auditing the process after the money's paid. Nobody cares what you bought. The idea is, was money paid or not? And was that a valid transaction? That's it. There's nothing upstream of that event. We could all debate here probably for hours, again, the voter ID issue. We're not here for that. All I'm saying is this is a downstream issue past the analogy of point of sale on, making sure that point of sale, that moment in time when you decide on something, the thing is cast.
So, well, I think Brenda and Mark had some thoughts on your question, and maybe maybe we can type a provisional ballot into it.
I thank you for asking for where's the conflict, because now I think I understand what you're asking is that paper ballots are more challenging for the disability community. So we do have ballot marking devices when we're using paper ballots, which is kind of the hybrid of a DRE with that accessibility that also then prints the ballot that gives us a voter verified ballot, and then that ballot is scanned. So that's how we navigate that. And I can't remember what else we were looking at there, but yeah. Does that answer your question? For the most part. Okay.
Yeah, I think, there was this challenge where Java did a great job of making our elections more accessible. Polling places got moved to places that were not gravel roads and a shack in the middle of a field, and you think I'm exaggerating. There was a precinct like that in Kentucky. So there are much more accessible places. There was this push, and part of the reason why we got into this spot is I think we pushed all of our voters into these DREs, which turned out to be not so very secure. And so in trying to address the accessibility issue, we made ourselves more vulnerable for security. And I think what you're getting at is as we're trying to address security, let's not overcorrect the other way. That's probably where your point is. Other questions or comments from the audience? Susan, I think, is standing in the back and wanting to weigh in here.
Hi, I'm Susan Greenholm, the Policy Director for the National Election Defense Coalition, so I'm a little bit of a ringer. But I have a question that I wanted Mark to address because it's something that we hear a lot. Very frequently, I see news accounts where some officials may say, well, our machines aren't connected to the internet, So they can't actually be compromised. Tony talked a little bit about that. Mark talked a little bit about that, but I'm giving you the head-on question. Why do you still need to audit your ballots if the machines aren't connected to the internet? Thanks.
So the short answer is connectivity to the internet has nothing to do with the ability to manipulate the systems. There are all sorts of ways to do this. You know, the most common might be a piece of malware that rides on something like a USB thumb drive that's moved from an internet-connected system to a voting system, and there the malware works its way through the voting system to effect a change. There was actually a case in one of the Nordic countries, I can't remember which, where someone actually wrote in a candidate on a piece of paper. Someone typed that in and had that piece of paper, what was entered in there, been processed correctly, it would have actually altered the results in the database. So you don't have to have these sorts of internet connectivity. You know, it's as simple as a device being moved from one environment to another. If there's an exposed port on a voting system and a nefarious actor is able to bring in their own thumb drive and insert it, they can gain entry to the system that way. You know, I like to point out to most people that prior to about 2000, almost all viruses, worms, malwares of all sorts jumped air gaps. You know, that's when you have these systems not connected to the internet. You know, when I was a teenager and we were doing stuff on Apple IIs, it was SneakerNet. You move a disk from one to the other and the virus goes with it. It's only very recently that you've seen these mass deployment of malware via network technology. It's not a requirement, and frequently there's better ways in terms of hiding your tracks than using an internet connection.
Great. Any other questions? We were hoping to wrap up around 1:30, so yeah, one question. Okay, this will be the last question.
Hi, my name's Allie. I'm a consultant for the Center of Secure and Modern Elections. And so the security of our election system is fragile, obviously. From the time that eligible citizens register to vote. So what do you all believe is the best way to secure and avoid foreign interference in our election system from the time that that eligible Americans register to vote on our rolls?
So most of our conversation today about machines, you're really talking about voter registration systems?
Correct. But, I mean, you know, the outcome of elections
Sure.
does have to do with actually getting voted on the rolls.
Yep.
Which is why.
Yep. Oh, yeah, no, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, sure. Brenda, you want to weigh in on that one? I know you're stuck. You're the election administrator who's here. I'll have some thoughts, but I promise you I will not let you leave you hanging on this one.
Virginia, which is my experience, we have a lot of ways of checking our data. We have a big, beautiful, colorful chart that I can show people when they come in that actually is pretty meaningful to them because it shows how our data is matched against the ERIC system, which is a multi-state, if you're registered in more than one state. If you state police for felony convictions, the court system for incapacity, social security numbers matching. So we get a lot of information about our system from comparing to and cooperating with other agencies.
So one of the things I'm really happy that's going around across the country is that we're seeing more databases being securely connected to one another. Used to be we did a lot of these updates via paper. And paper would just, you fill out a card and it would be entered in. There might be a typo. Now, in a lot of states, when you have update your driver's license, instead of just getting that piece of paper update, they'll actually transfer that automatically. It's verified. Most people keep track of their driver's license. They keep track of their address. That stays really current. And the result in a growing number of states is that we're going to have more people registered to vote, but we're also going to have more accurate information, and that's going to be transferred more securely. And once you make up all those updates, it's actually going to save you money, even with the cost of those updates. So it's this nice win-win where you're going to get better data and it's going to cost less money. We're starting to see this happen from legislation being passed as well as at the administrative level. States are doing this and not even really talking about it because it's a no-brainer with technology. So it's kind of an exciting time. I was actually in another state on Monday talking with a Republican about how they could do this in their state, and he was pretty excited. So it's becoming bipartisan, and it is an important part of having confidence in that system, that the voter registration list is accurate. And so those people then are voting, and their votes are going to count, and we have confidence in that. And then win or lose, we might not be happy with the outcome, but we're going to be satisfied that the person who got the most votes intentionally was the one who won. And I can still remember conversations on election night with, when there's a close race, and if you have confidence in your system, even if you're the losing party, you're not happy, you might be bummed out for a while, but you accept it. And that's the place we want to be in this country. And with some changes, like some good federal legislation, like some good states, legislation, administrative changes, we can do that. So thank you all for coming out today. We really appreciate it. We're happy to take some more questions for those who can stick around afterwards. Markup tomorrow, Senate Rules Committee in the morning, and hopefully that'll be a continued conversation about how can we strengthen our elections and keep them secure. Thanks.